In late January of 1943, in the harbor at Wewak on the northern coast of New Guinea, a Japanese convoy escort commander realized, far too late, that his ships were not alone in the anchorage. Single American submarine, commanded by a Navy officer named Dudley Morton, had slipped past the harbor's defenses on the surface at periscope depth, identified every ship at anchor, and begun systematically attacking them, one at a time, as though the harbor itself were a shooting gallery rather than a defended anchorage. By the time Morton's submarine, the USS Wahoo, withdrew, it had sunk or damaged several ships in a single, sustained assault that Japanese naval records would later describe with a mixture of confusion and alarm, an attack so aggressive and unconventional that it did not match the cautious, defensive submarine doctrine Japanese commanders had been trained to expect from American forces up to that point in the war. This is the story of Dudley "Mush" Morton, the submarine captain who tore up the rulebook that had constrained American submarine warfare for the first year of the Pacific War, and the campaign of aggressive, unrelenting attacks that made his name, and the name of his ship, something Japanese merchant crews and convoy escorts genuinely feared crossing paths with. The pre-war doctrine that produced this cautious approach was not simply an arbitrary policy choice, but reflected genuine, reasonable assumptions submarine planners had made based on the limited combat experience and technology available before the war began. Submarines of this era were relatively slow, vulnerable when surfaced, and equipped with a finite number of torpedoes per patrol, and pre-war planners reasonably worried that overly aggressive tactics risked exposing valuable and difficult-to-replace submarines to unnecessary destruction for marginal additional tactical gain. It took the specific combination of a demonstrably broken weapon system and mounting frustration among frontline commanders, more than any single flaw in the underlying doctrinal reasoning itself, to eventually produce the tactical revolution Morton and a handful of similarly aggressive contemporaries would come to represent. To understand why Morton's arrival represented such a dramatic break from what came before, it helps to understand just how disappointing American submarine warfare had been for the first full year of the Pacific War, despite genuine bravery and skill among the crews involved. The United States entered the war with a submarine force built around a cautious pre-war doctrine that emphasized submerged, defensive attacks against individual targets, firing torpedoes from a safe distance and withdrawing immediately afterward, rather than pressing home sustained aggressive assaults against entire convoys. Compounding this cautious doctrine was a technical problem that plagued American submarines for roughly the first 2 years of the war, and that submarine crews suspected almost immediately, but that the Navy's Ordnance Bureau was slow to acknowledge. The standard Mark 14 torpedo suffered from a combination of defects, including a magnetic exploder that frequently failed to detonate and a depth control mechanism that often ran significantly deeper than set, causing torpedoes to pass harmlessly beneath their targets without exploding at all. The practical result of this combination, cautious doctrine paired with unreliable weapons, was a submarine force that, for the war's first year, sank far fewer Japanese ships than its actual number of patrols and torpedoes fired should have produced, a source of enormous frustration for submarine crews who repeatedly reported watching torpedoes strike a target's hull and fail to explode, only to have those reports dismissed or doubted by ordnance officers reluctant to admit a fundamental design flaw in a weapon the Navy had spent years developing. It would take sustained pressure from frustrated submarine commanders, combined with controlled testing that finally reproduced the failures under observation, to force the Navy to acknowledge and begin correcting the Mark 14's problems, a process that dragged well into 1943, even as American submarines continued patrolling, with weapons crews increasingly distrusted. The frustration among submarine crews over the Mark 14's failures cannot be overstated as a factor shaping morale during this period. Captains would maneuver for hours to achieve a perfect firing position, expend scarce torpedoes on what should have been a certain kill, and then watch through the periscope as the torpedo either failed to explode on impact or, in cases where the depth control problem was to blame, passed harmlessly beneath the target's keel entirely, visible as a telltale wake, with no resulting explosion at all. Some commanders, suspecting a problem with the magnetic exploder specifically, began ordering their crews to disable that feature and rely solely on contact detonation, an unofficial workaround that predated the Navy's own formal acknowledgement of the design flaw by many months. Dudley Morton took command of the USS Wahoo in December of 1942, inheriting a submarine that had already completed several patrols under a previous captain without particularly distinguished results. A fairly typical outcome given the doctrinal caution and torpedo problems affecting the entire submarine force at the time. Morton, whose nickname Mush reportedly originated from a college football teammate's mispronunciation of a fictional radio character rather than anything connected to his personality, brought with him an entirely different philosophy of submarine combat, one built around aggression, sustained pursuit, and a willingness to remain engaged with a target or convoy far longer than pre-war doctrine considered prudent. Central to Morton's new approach was his partnership with his executive officer, Richard O'Kane, who would take over the periscope and, in Morton's restructured command arrangement, personally handle target identification and firing solutions, while Morton himself focused on overall tactical command of the boat, freeing him to think about positioning and pursuit strategy rather than being tied to the periscope himself during an attack. This division of responsibility, unusual for submarine command practice at the time, allowed the Wahoo to execute more complex, sustained attacks against multiple targets in sequence than a single officer trying to handle both roles simultaneously could typically manage. Morton's tactical innovations extended well beyond crew organization. Where pre-war doctrine emphasized submerged attacks and immediate withdrawal, Morton frequently kept the Wahoo on the surface at night, using the boat's surface speed advantage and, later in the war, surface search radar to approach targets more quickly and reposition for follow-up attacks against a convoy's additional ships, rather than treating a single successful torpedo strike as the natural end of an engagement. This approach carried genuinely greater risk, exposing the submarine to surface gunfire and ramming attempts from escort vessels that a submerged approach would have avoided. But it also allowed the Wahoo to inflict damage on a scale that cautious, single-target submerged attacks simply could not match. Morton's personal command style aboard the Wahoo also departed from the more formal, reserved conduct expected of a submarine captain in this era. He was known among his crew for an informal, direct manner of communication, briefing his men candidly on tactical plans, and, according to several crew members' later recollections, cultivating a sense of collective aggression and purpose aboard the boat that stood in noticeable contrast to the more procedurally cautious atmosphere aboard submarines commanded under the older doctrine. This command culture, crew members later suggested, contributed meaningfully to the Wahoo's willingness to press attacks that a more conventionally cautious crew might have been less inclined to sustain under similar risk. The patrol that established Morton's reputation, and the Wahoo's, began in late January of 1943, near Wewak, on the New Guinea coast, where Morton located a Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce and resupply garrison forces in the area. Rather than executing a single attack and withdrawing, Morton pursued the convoy relentlessly over an extended engagement, repositioning the Wahoo repeatedly to bring fresh torpedo salvos against different ships in the convoy, as damaged vessels fell behind or as escort ships temporarily lost contact with the submarine. By the time the engagement concluded, Morton's aggressive, sustained pursuit tactics had inflicted losses on the convoy far beyond what a single conventional attack would have achieved. A demonstration of exactly the kind of unrelenting approach that separated Morton's command philosophy from the more cautious doctrine that had defined the submarine force's first year of war. This single patrol, when Morton's after-action report reached Pacific Fleet Submarine Command, prompted a significant reassessment of submarine tactics doctrine more broadly. Admiral Charles Lockwood, who took command of the Pacific Submarine Force in early 1943, at almost the exact moment Morton's aggressive results were becoming apparent, used patrols like Morton's as evidence in his own ongoing push to both fix the Mark 14 torpedoes' technical problems and encourage a more aggressive tactical doctrine across the entire submarine force, moving away from the cautious, defensive approach that had characterized the war's opening year toward something closer to what Morton had already been demonstrating independently at Wewak. Lockwood's broader tactical reforms extended beyond simply encouraging aggression for its own sake. He pushed for improved coordination between submarines operating in overlapping patrol areas, better use of intelligence derived from code-breaking to position submarines against known convoy routes, and continued pressure on the Naval Ordnance Bureau to finally address the Mark 14's defects definitively rather than through the piecemeal, informal workarounds individual commanders like Morton had been forced to rely on. By late 1943, with the torpedoes' problems substantially corrected and aggressive tactics increasingly standard across the submarine force, rather than the exception, a single innovative captain had demonstrated, American submarine effectiveness against Japanese shipping began the steep upward trajectory that would define the campaign's final 2 years. Japanese merchant marine crews and convoy escort commanders operating in the areas where the Wahoo patrolled developed a specific and, according to post-war Japanese accounts examined by historians, genuinely fearful reputation for the submarine and its captain, a reputation distinct from the more generalized anxiety about American submarines that existed across the Pacific by this stage of the war. Japanese escort commanders, accustomed to American submarines that typically fired a single torpedo salvo and withdrew, found Morton's pattern of sustained, repeated attacks against the same convoy deeply unsettling precisely because it broke the pattern their own defensive doctrine had been built to counter. An escort vessel that successfully drove off what it believed was a single submarine attack might, under Morton's tactics, find the same submarine repositioning for a second or third assault hours later, a persistence that Japanese post-war accounts describe as producing genuine dread among convoy crews operating in areas associated with the Wahoo's patrols. It is important, in telling this story honestly, to include an episode from one of Morton's patrols that has remained a subject of serious historical and ethical debate ever since. Following the sinking of a Japanese troop transport, survivors from the vessel found themselves in the water and in small boats, and the Wahoo's crew, on Morton's orders, fired on these survivors, an action that post-war historians and naval ethicists have examined and criticized as a violation of the laws of naval warfare regarding attacks on shipwrecked survivors, whatever the tactical justification Morton may have believed applied, given the ongoing risk that armed troops in the water near a combat zone might pose. This episode complicates any account of Morton that focuses solely on his tactical innovation and effectiveness, and it is presented here not to sensationalize the incident, but because an honest historical account of Morton's command cannot omit the aspects of his conduct that have drawn serious and legitimate criticism from historians studying the ethics of submarine warfare in the Pacific. Historians examining the survivors' incident in the decades since have generally situated it within a broader and uncomfortable pattern that appeared, in isolated cases, on more than one occasion during the submarine war in the Pacific, without suggesting it represented standard or officially sanctioned practice across the submarine force as a whole. Naval historians studying Morton's own justification, as it was later reconstructed from crew accounts and his own reports, note that he appears to have framed the action as a response to a perceived ongoing threat from armed personnel in the water, rather than as an indiscriminate act, a distinction that does not resolve the serious ethical and legal problems historians have identified with the incident, but that is relevant to understanding it within the specific, chaotic circumstances of the engagement, rather than as a simple, uncomplicated act of cruelty divorced from any tactical reasoning at all. Morton's aggressive tactics, whatever the moral complexity of some of his specific decisions, produced a run of successful patrols through the first half of 1943 that established the Wahoo as one of the most effective American submarines operating in the Pacific during this period, contributing directly to the broader submarine campaign that was, by this stage of the war, beginning to inflict serious and sustained damage on Japan's merchant shipping capacity. The lifeline connecting the home islands to the resource-rich territories Japan had seized across Southeast Asia and the Pacific earlier in the war. Every ship sunk by submarines like the Wahoo represented not just an immediate tactical loss for Japan, but a compounding strategic problem, since Japan's shipbuilding capacity could not remotely keep pace with the rate at which American submarines, once properly armed and aggressively commanded, began sinking merchant tonnage through 1943 and into the following years of the war. Between the Wewak engagement and her final loss, the Wahoo completed several more patrols under Morton's command that continued to demonstrate the same aggressive tactical pattern, expanding his reputation both within the American submarine force, where his results were increasingly studied and emulated by other commanders, and among Japanese shipping interests operating in the areas he patrolled. The submarine force's own internal recognition of Morton's effectiveness translated into growing operational latitude, with Pacific Fleet Submarine Command increasingly willing to trust aggressive captains with more autonomous, extended patrol assignments rather than the closer, more conservative oversight that had characterized submarine operations earlier in the war. The Wahoo's story, and Morton's, ended in October of 1943, when the submarine failed to return from a patrol into the Sea of Japan through the La Perouse Strait, a narrow and heavily defended passage between Japanese home waters. The Wahoo was lost with her entire crew, including Morton himself, in circumstances that remained uncertain for decades afterward, with the specific cause of her loss, whether to a Japanese mine, aircraft attack, or surface vessel, not definitively established through wartime records alone. It was only in 2006, more than 6 decades after her loss, that Russian divers located and identified the Wahoo's wreck in the strait, finally providing physical confirmation of where and roughly how the submarine met her end, closing a mystery that had persisted for the families of her lost crew since the war's final years. The scale of the American submarine campaign's ultimate impact on Japan's war economy is difficult to overstate, and it is worth placing Morton's individual contribution within that larger context. By the final full year of the war, American submarines operating throughout the Pacific had sunk a substantial majority of Japan's pre-war merchant tonnage, a rate of destruction that Japanese shipbuilding, already strained by material shortages and the diversion of industrial capacity toward other war priorities, had no realistic capacity to replace. Oil tankers proved a particularly critical target category, since Japan's entire war effort depended on shipping crude oil from the Dutch East Indies and other captured territories back to refineries in the home islands, and submarine attacks against this tanker traffic specifically produced fuel shortages that, by the war's final year, were affecting everything from military aircraft training hours to the operational range of what remained of the Japanese surface fleet. The La Perouse Strait Patrol that claimed the Wahoo was, by design, an unusually dangerous assignment even by the standards of aggressive Pacific submarine warfare, since the passage into the Sea of Japan required transiting narrow, heavily patrolled waters close to the Japanese home islands themselves, an area where American submarines faced concentrated anti-submarine defenses that made the operational risk considerably higher than patrols conducted further from Japan's immediate coastal waters. That Morton and his crew were assigned, or in some accounts volunteered for, exactly this kind of high-risk patrol reflects the same aggressive operational philosophy that had defined the Wahoo's combat record from the beginning, an approach that had produced extraordinary results through most of 1943, but that also meant the submarine and her crew were operating with a persistently smaller margin for error than a more cautious patrol assignment would have allowed. Richard O'Kane, Morton's executive officer during the Wahoo's most famous patrols, went on to take command of his own submarine, the USS Tang, applying much of what he had learned under Morton's aggressive command philosophy to become, by the time of the Tang's loss in October of 1944, the highest-scoring American submarine commander of the entire war by tonnage sunk. The Tang was lost under uniquely tragic circumstances, struck by one of her own torpedoes that malfunctioned and circled back into her own hull during a surface night attack, an ending that underscored just how genuinely dangerous the aggressive, close-range tactics pioneered by Morton and carried forward by O'Kane actually were, even for the submarine force's most skilled and successful practitioners. O'Kane survived the sinking, was captured by Japanese forces, and endured the remainder of the war as a prisoner before being liberated and eventually receiving the Medal of Honor for his wartime service, one of the relatively small number of American submarine officers to receive the nation's highest military honor. The broader submarine campaign that Morton's aggressive tactics helped push the Pacific Fleet toward ultimately proved to be one of the most strategically significant American contributions to the eventual defeat of Japan, a campaign that, by the war's final year, had sunk such a substantial proportion of Japan's merchant marine that the country's ability to move oil, raw materials, and food between the home islands and its remaining overseas territories had been severely and irreversibly damaged, a strategic effect that, alongside the more publicly celebrated carrier and air battles across the Pacific, played a direct role in Japan's declining capacity to sustain the war through its final years. Morton himself, killed before he could see the full strategic impact of the tactical revolution he had helped start, remains remembered in submarine force history as a genuinely transformative and, in the specific matter of the survivors' incident, genuinely controversial figure, a combination the historical record does not allow to be simplified in either direction. If you want to understand how one aggressive submarine captain, operating against both cautious American doctrine and defective American torpedoes, helped rewrite the tactics that would eventually help strangle Japan's ability to supply its own war effort, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.